I see the countdown at the top.
Can you like raise your hand? I don't see it.
It's above Joy's head in her
Oh,
square.
okay. 15 seconds. 17. We're live.
Mhm.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Charla Jackson. I'm the president of the Camellia Rose, Georgia chapter of the Links Incorporated, and we welcome you today to our Tools for Healthy Living, Mental Health and Suicide Prevention. I'm wearing purple today because, like many of our African American families, our chapter has been affected by suicide. And we wanted to raise awareness and provide you with tools on addressing suicide and depression and other mental health issues so that no one else has to ever experience this tragedy. We are going to be joined by some great speakers. They're going to be introduced by our moderator, Joy White. Joy White has 25 years in the healthcare field, and she is passionate about helping others with mental health. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Joy White.
Thank you much, Charla, so much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for what we hope to be a very open, honest, candid, comforting, and informative conversation regarding both the state of our mental health and to better understand and recognize all issues related to suicide, suicide prevention, and suicide ideation. We are so very blessed to have two dynamic women join us this evening, both whom in their own right are positively affecting change around education, training, and uplift for African American women around the stability of mental health. First, we have Ms. Tasha Webb, who's the owner of Variable Alternatives. She is a licensed clinical psychologist, and she specializes in all things dealing with women, but specifically around issues of anxiety, depression, grief, and suicide ideation. Tasha will bring us information around data, around tools, around myths, everything we need to know around suicide and how to help ourselves and our village cope with these issues. Secondly, we have Ms. Shanti Das, who is the founder and executive director of Silence the Shame, a nationally recognized organization whose mission is to educate and prevent and to uplift all things around mental wellness. Shanti's organization does a lot of national trainings, community conversations such as this, and bringing people together to understand and to get rid of the stigma around mental health issues. But I really want to ground us as we begin this conversation around the facts. In this over sensationalized world that we're living in right now, this particular topic is too important to get lost in a guess. So, Tasha, if you would you share some information with us and our audience around those key data elements and data points around suicide in the African American women community? And then also talk a little bit about some of the myths and misconceptions around suicide and suicide ideation.
Okay. Thank you, Joy, for that introduction. If we can pull up the slides, we can go to the next slide. So I'm going to just kind of briefly talk a little bit about, there's so many different things we can talk about when it comes to suicidality. I'm just going to provide us with some brief background to help us with our conversation and our open discussion a little bit later in the evening. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death overall in the United States, claiming about 48,000 lives each year. While you're more likely to hear about homicides in the United States, there's actually more suicides that occur in the United States than homicides, but you're less likely to hear about it because there's still this, like we said earlier, taboo or stigma associated with the subject of death and dying, and particularly taking of your own life. When it comes to African American women, we are less likely than our male counterparts to commit suicide, but more likely to make attempts. These some of the statistics around that is that have increased recently is that we're seeing more lethal means of suicide attempts resulting in completions due to the increase in access to guns and prescription medications that are lethal. African American women, though, are one of the good things I would say is that we are perceived, and I underline that, to be less likely to consider suicide due to the resilience in the face of adversity and discrimination of all the races and genders. However, because of that perception, we are often overlooked when it comes to suicide or in need of help. Can you go to the next slide? So we're going to talk a little bit about two important myths that I feel will be good for this discussion tonight. Can you go to the next one? Talking about suicide, or people who are talking about suicide are only seeking attention, or they just want to kind of overemphasize what they're going through. Next slide. The truth is, no matter how casually someone talks about suicide or they talk about it in jest, suicide threats should never be ignored because it's oftentimes the first time someone will take the opportunity to express the difficulty they may be having with either an emotional issue, a relationship issue, or medical issue. And oftentimes they don't know how to bring up the subject due to that perception that they don't know how to handle their situation. So whether they talk about it casually or they come in a crisis situation should never be minimized and always considered a plea for help, and attention is needed immediately so that we can take that opportunity to help problem solve to get that person through the next day. Next. One of the other common myths, particularly in the African American community, because we don't really talk about suicidality or mental health, people often think that someone won't harm themselves because they have certain things going on in their life, or they have these certain statuses that they won't do it. Or when talking to them about suicide, that they told me that they're not gonna hurt themselves, or they promised me they wouldn't hurt themselves. One of the things that you want to do when you're talking to someone who is potentially suicidal is to get to what it is that they're going through so that you can kind of help them identify problems. What commonly tends to happen, while it's some good intentions, people usually try to reason with the person or convince them that what they're thinking about killing themselves over is not worth it. While that may make a person feel better, it doesn't do anything for the person who is actually in the situation, because what they're seeking is an answer to their problem or relief from the pain, not necessarily a justification as to why they are even thinking about doing it or considering it. Next. Wealth, status, children, being a good Christian, or having a good life are not factors that protect a person from suicidal thoughts. If a person is expressing emotional pain, does not have a solution for the problem, suicidality is a real option for them to consider, because all they're looking for is how to stop the pain. Again, whether it's an emotional pain or physical pain or a problem for which they have no solution. If they have a solution, if they have a way, or if they can see a way through, and again, if they can see a way through, then suicide is not an option. Without that simple thing, they will consider suicide and they will attempt. And some of them will be successful. Next. Signs of suicidal thinking. I think it's important when helping someone who might be suicidal, it's important to know what some of the common signs of suicidal thinking, and some of the basics are we're going to talk about tonight, and we can kind of express that or elaborate on a little bit more in the open discussion. Is anyone thinking about hurting themselves or killing themselves is a sign for help, whether they're joking about it or what have you, or they say something, but they say they really don't mean it. Just the idea of considering that out loud or in front of someone else is a sign for help and should be taken seriously. Looking for ways to die is one of the classic signs of suicidality. A person saying they're going to buy a gun. Buying a gun in itself is not mean someone's going to kill themselves, but someone in the midst of a emotional crisis or in a lot of pain, or thinking about buying a gun or stacking up on pills and things like that, they are looking for ways to end their life. So you want to be mindful of that kind of dynamic coupled with something that's seriously going on in someone's life. As we stated earlier, talking about death, dying, hurting, or killing oneself is another active way that someone might be looking for or considering suicidality. engaging in self-destructive or risk-taking behavior, especially if it's out of the norm for someone. So some of the risky behaviors that I've seen is people suddenly entering or engaging in speeding on the highway, which you may not think about that, but particularly when I work with a lot of veteran populations, one of the things that we saw with our soldiers coming back, male and female, was speeding on the highway or driving reckless. Some of those sort of things or should be things that you want to consider when someone is thinking about suicide. And then particularly experiencing desperate situations or unable to express a reasonable solution to a problem that works for them is another way. So again, overall, when a person is thinking about suicidality, the core issue is, do they have a reasonable way out of a situation that they themselves are experiencing? It doesn't matter what we think about the situation or that we think this is not something worth killing themselves over. It is what the person is thinking themselves and them being able to come up with a reasonable solution with our help or something that they come up on their own. By the time they come to us seeking help, more than likely they have tried everything they know to do. So this is our opportunity to try to intervene to give them some additional options so that suicidality is not one of those. Thank you.
Thank you, Tasha, for both the sobering facts and the eye-opening realities when it comes to, myths versus realities. And as we think about those areas that you laid out, Shanti, if you don't mind, and to the degree that you're comfortable, I would like for you to share with us, and especially with our audience, and I'm gonna give a little bit more background about you. One thing I was remiss about, and I'm super proud of, you come from the music industry. You are nationally known, been in the music industry for 25 years. And at some point in your life, you decided to create a foundation around mental health, mental wellness, and awareness. Can you talk a little bit about your journey to how you got here? And from that, we're going to take a little bit of your journey and some of the facts that Tasha provided us and talk a little bit more and get into our conversation that we really want to engage in on what are the signs, what are the triggers, what are the things we need to think about, and then how we can help move us as a collective village forward. So Shanti, if you would share.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you, Tasha, for all of those facts. It was interesting just reading through some of the facts and just, reflecting back on my own past lived experience. So Joy, it hasn't been easy for me, although I've had an incredible life and journey. I'm very grateful for the opportunities that God bestowed upon me in the entertainment industry. But for those that don't know, my father took his own life when I was 7 months old. And my mom's Black, but my dad was actually of Indian descent. But the more that I'm learning in South Asian culture, is very taboo, and the stigma is still very high there around mental illness. And he did not leave a note. It happened one afternoon. My mom was cooking dinner, and she went to tell my dad that dinner was ready and found him on the side of my sister's bed. He had died by a gunshot wound to the head. So that kind of started my journey with mental health and mental illness. So as I got a little bit older and learned what suicide was and that my dad wouldn't be coming back, I became very angry, and I wouldn't allow my mom to talk about him rather. And so fast forward, I kind of buried myself in my work, grew up in the SWATs. I know a lot of the ladies in this chapter that I grew up with, had a really great career, as I mentioned, in the music industry. And so life was good, as I thought. But as I started experiencing a lot of success, there's a lot of difficulties that arise in the workplace, and, working in a high-paced industry, there were times where I felt like, my anxiety was just heightened. And so I'll never forget in 2001, things were really tough at the job. I was being overlooked for a promotion. I was crying a lot. I was frustrated. It was a volatile situation and environment. And I'll never forget, I said the words, maybe I should just kill myself. I was talking one night to my boyfriend, and that scared me. The fact that I uttered those words, maybe I should just kill myself. Now, I know we hear that term, quote unquote, thrown around a lot. And I hate when people throw it out there and they're not serious about it and don't understand the ramifications of it. But I knew for me to say that, because my dad had taken his own life, that was serious. And my boyfriend knew that as well. So he immediately had me call my sister, and she convinced me to go to counseling. That's the first time in my 30s, my early 30s is when I first went to counseling. So fast forward, I went to counseling for a few months, but I really didn't stick with it. And I didn't fully forgive my father. I left my job as executive vice president in 2010. My mom developed Alzheimer's, and I came back home to Atlanta, Georgia. Now, you can imagine being in a career like the music business, making a ton of money, the corner office, the Range Rover, and all that we aspire to achieve and become. I had all of that, but I couldn't shake the depression that I was starting to experience, the anxiety. And my friends didn't really recognize it. I had a really good way of hiding it. And so a lot of people that go through a lot of this, unfortunately, we hide a lot of our issues and behavior patterns from friends and family. And then in 2014, my best friend took her own life, an African-American female. And I talked to her the day before it happened. Well, you can imagine what that did to me. I blamed myself. I went back over in my head what the warning signs were. How could I have missed them? You know, again, looking at a lot of what Tasha talked about, I still to this day wonder, you know, if I could have saved my friend. I heard that she had bought a gun a few days before, but she told the person that she was buying it to protect herself. But I knew she knew what she was doing. And that final phone call that we had, she was telling me like how much she loved me and how proud of me she was. And I thought that was odd, because we were on the phone trying to find some better care for her. So long story short, I talked myself into a downward spiral that entire year. I really had just gotten to a low point because I walked away from the music industry. So many of my peers were still in it, making hundreds of thousands of dollars. Here I am doing community service work, a change of career. So I had stressful life situations. I had a family history of suicide. It was just a lot of the warning signs that were there for me. And so in 2015, I had counted up all the pills in my medicine cabinet. Tasha talked about, you know, seeking out pills, you know, and really doing that work. And I did the work. I went through and counted every single pill I had. And I'm afraid of guns because of how my dad took his own life. But I thought that if I took pills, it would be an easier way to go. And I'll tell you guys, it wasn't that I wanted to die. I didn't want to die. I just wanted the pain to go away. And I just kept having these thoughts in my head telling me to kill myself. And so I got out of the house that night and I was driving around Atlanta. And by the grace of God, a friend of mine I ran into a friend of mine at a store, and she knew something was seriously wrong. And so once again, she convinced me to call my sister. My sister kind of helped to raise me after our dad died, to help my mom out. So I called the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-TALK. And that started me on my journey to recovery, Joy and Tasha, and everyone that's listening in. The fact that I was able to de-escalate the crisis that I was in at the time. And then I texted my pastor, Dr. Raphael G. Warnock of Ebenezer, and he said, I will pray with you, but you got to go to the doctor. You got to get help. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. You've got to get the help. And so I went to see a psychiatrist, started taking antidepressants, and started talking more about my experience. And that's kind of how Silence to Shame was born. And I'm going to end here, but so that was in 2015. And I told you that my sister was the one who saved my life essentially twice. Well, she passed away last year unexpectedly on vacation with her daughter in Cancun, Mexico. And I have to really, we're going to get into triggers and warning signs. And I'll be lying if I said there were times where over the last year and a half that I have been having some interesting thoughts, and thoughts that I know I need to continue to seek help and to get help for what I'm going through in terms of the grief, because the grief can be so debilitating. And so if anyone has had even past thoughts of suicide attempts or suicidal ideation, it's important that we stay in touch with them, that we surround them with love and a support system, because anything could trigger that and could trigger those moments. But I'm alive, I'm here, and I'm honored to be able to share with this chapter tonight.
Okay, so I'm super full right now. Thank you for your candor, and for being completely and unashamedly honest. It's a lot to unpack. And as you were talking, I was thinking about our earlier conversations And the first thing that kind of came to mind from a conversational standpoint is this. Tasha, you made a statement on one of our planning calls, and I thought it was going to come from a myth, but it was not even a myth, it's truth. And then Shanti's testimony, for lack of a better term, in my mind kind of confirmed it. I want you to speak a little bit about this, that there is a thought process and or myth that those who commit suicide and or are eventually successful at committing suicide are weak-minded people. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then Shanti, if you could kind of espouse a little bit after Tasha, just around that whole thought process. But Tasha, if you will, from a clinical perspective.
Yes, when I first got into the realm of suicidality, I heard a psychologist, his name escapes me just off the top of my head, talk about the death of his father. And it was the first time I had heard about suicidality expressed this way, because just from the media, television and stuff, they always sort of shown suicidality to be someone who is just, in the spur of the moment, or someone who is weak-minded, or someone who's just so fragile that, they just think about suicide and they make an attempt. They may be successful or they may not be. But the truth about suicidality is not a weak-minded person at all. In order to consider suicide, to know that you're going to do something that is so lethal that it will take your life, you have to fight against that natural instinct to survive in order to be successful in that type of process, even if your attempt is not. Does that make sense? So, for example, I can't swim at all. But to jump into an ocean with no one around in the middle of the night, with knowing that I can't swim, I'm not going to be safe. But if I jump into that water, my body will automatically fight against the drowning process. But when someone who is suicidal, what happens is they're able to overcome that natural instinct. That's not something someone can easily do. And then a lot of things go into the thought process. Like the young lady was talking about earlier, when she was talking, what I was thinking about was all the patients that I've worked with, in my career, who talk about all the different things that they have done before they express that first idea that there might be suicide to someone else. So they've gone through everything they know through their family, through their own personal experiences, to try to come up with a solution for whatever it is that's hurting them. And they don't have one. And so by the time they get to the point where they say, you know what, I'm thinking about this, or they've made an attempt, they have gotten to that point or close to that triggering event that makes them stop that natural process that prevents them from wanting to survive to wanting to die. And again, I can't stress enough that this is not something for the weak-minded person. It is really something. It takes a lot of grit to be able to consider such an idea and then go through and follow through and actually do it.
Wow. Shanti, would you like to add to that?
I'll just add a little bit. Oftentimes we hear people use the statement, suicide is selfish. How could that person, be so selfish to leave children or family members? And I use that statement myself. I said it about my father. And it took my mom and other people to get me to understand that my dad actually loved me. He was a very strong man, but he was sick. And he could not control those thoughts and emotions. And unfortunately, he was successful in his suicide attempt. Me, on the other hand, there were times where I thought that I was weak. And there was this internal struggle going on because, as you mentioned, I had this big career in the entertainment industry, and even my peers, and growing up in Southwest Atlanta. And we celebrate each other, right, as kings and queens of our villages, and we put each other up on pedestals. And it was an extremely low point for me. And I was embarrassed, and I was worried about what friends and families would say about me. But to Tasha's point, it took a strength that I can't put my finger on, right? That I can't categorize. It's an intangible, right? It's that gift and strength that God gave me, because I am a spiritual person as well. So I believe you can pray and get help around mental illness and emotional health and wellness. And it was only the grace of God that gave me that strength that night to get out of the house, because I felt like my weak side would have stayed home, would have taken those pills, and it would have been a very different situation. And I was prepared to take enough pills that I thought would actually seal the deal. Because sometimes when people attempt suicide, it's a cry for help. And we've seen that oftentimes in many cases, in many situations. But if you're serious about it, there is a strength that, yeah, you're going to do it and you're going to complete the job. And I was serious about it, but thank God, I used the other side of my strength to get out of the house. And I did not complete the act. And I just want to say another thing. We talk about committing suicide. That's been used probably since the beginning of time that we've been talking about it as a country. But now I like to say either died by suicide or completed suicide, because some professionals and people with lived experiences feel like when you say commit, it denotes an act of criminal behavior. And I don't think that you're necessarily committing a crime, because you're not in your right frame of mind when you're having those thoughts and those negative emotions, and sometimes you can't shake it. And so, yeah, I'm not embarrassed. I don't think I'm the strongest person, but I don't think I'm weak either. I just think that I've been fortunate and blessed to be able to get the help that I needed and to be able to help others.
I concur.
When you mentioned my other side of strength, it makes me think of something. African American women especially are known to be warriors by nature and by nurture. We shoulder and handle a lot. And it is an inherent thought that is nothing you can throw at us that we cannot see ourselves through. And it's generational. We are the mothers, the sisters, the caregivers, the aunties, now the corporate executives and caregivers of parents. We shoulder and we do it all. And I think that we're also the ultimate mask wearers. We can have 17,000 things going on in our lives and still wake up in the morning, put that smile on, put that armor on, walk out the door, and we do what we do to get things done. But we're also not very good at being honest about when the load is getting just a tad bit too heavy. Mm-hmm. When there's one more thing that can't get on that list for me to handle. And that one thing can be the smallest thing in the world. So I want to talk a little bit around triggers. What do people consider to be triggers around suicidal ideation? And then how, as those who are loved ones, recognize those triggers or recognize the triggers in ourselves? Monty, let's start with you.
So I'll start by saying, first of all, Silence or Shame, we did a really incredible panel discussion a couple months ago around debunking the superwoman notion for African-American women and mental health. And so the one thing I will say is we all have a breaking point, and we are human first. We're human first, then we are Black women, but we've got to learn to take those capes off, ladies, because you can't be everything to everybody. And especially with what's going on with the pandemic, things are changing, situations are different in our lives. There's more uncertainty. There's a lot of death around us. And so you got to be able to get to a point where you learn to pour back into yourself. And I know we're going to talk about self-care at the end and resources, but I cannot stress that enough. You got to let people in too. For me, in terms of triggers, I think my biggest trigger was either when someone else took their own life, because I've had other friends in the entertainment industry that have died by suicide. That was always a trigger for me. And it just made me kind of stop and put me in a weird space, in a weird mood. And unfortunately, I wasn't going to therapy then. Anytime it was a holiday, or my best friend's birthday or the anniversary of her death, what is it, September 29th. And I'm going to try not to get emotional, but, you know, every year of my dad's anniversary of his suicide is a trigger for me. And it's September 26th. And I had a really tough weekend. And somebody might say, but you were 7 months old. It doesn't matter. It's still the fact that my father, my own flesh and blood, took his own life, and that I still feel like I struggle. And that as much as I pour into other people, sometimes I try to keep that cape on and be everything to everybody. And I'm still not fully recovered through this process. So I recognize, and the blessing is I do know what those triggers are. So I try not to stay isolated. I get out of this house. I go take a walk. I can call my therapist if I need to, and I can depend on certain friends and family. I have like a circle of, I like to call it my starting five. If I know I'm being triggered by something, there are certain girlfriends or family members that I can call that can instantly be there for me. Sometimes I just need to talk. I don't need you to fix me. I don't need you to, tell me what's going on. I just need you to sit there and listen to me. And that is super important. When someone is dealing with suicidal ideation, sometimes we just need an ear. We don't need you to fix us right away. But you have to sit there and listen and see what the person is going through and see what's going on. Because as super women, right, and that cape that we wear, we go into fix-it mode. But sometimes we have to just sit there and just sit with the person and allow them to talk and get things off of their chest. And then, process through it and then determine if they need to see a psychiatrist or a therapist or get help or whatever. But you got to be willing to just sit there and listen and don't feel like it's a burden on your life, right? You got to lead with empathy and not sympathy.
I concur. I think what I would like to say to that or add on to it is that there's a difference between a trigger and the tipping point. I think each individual person has their own triggers. It could be, so I'm going to be very frank. People have different triggers, and suicidality is an option for people. It has more to do with their personal situation or their life situation. And then oftentimes some common things that happen that put people at greater risk is having a history of suicidality in the family. That's one thing, because for me as a clinician, I see suicidality or the idea of considering suicidality as a coping mechanism. Now, one of the things we talked about before in preparation for this is talking about resiliency and our ability to be able to look within the things that we've done before to help us get through difficult situations, looking at how our parents got through difficult situations, our grandparents, our community, how they've endured and overcome things. But when there is no option, when you can't see a way through, that is when suicidality is a consideration. The tipping point to that is, like the young lady said earlier, is there could be something like an anniversary, the straw that breaks the camel back that tipped you over. But understanding when someone is going through something and something is changing, that is when you want to look for the tipping point. Like, for example, one of the things I often talk about is a young man who came to an emergency room where I was working at, and he had talked about breaking up with his girlfriend, and he wanted to kill himself over. Well, when he came to the emergency room, that's a crisis situation. But when somebody heard that, and like 3 people who saw him before I did, they were like, oh, he's not gonna kill himself. He just, he buckled his girlfriend. That's nothing to kill yourself over. But when you heard his real story, you didn't hear about all the things that had let him down or the different things that have happened to him in his life before he came to that emergency room that night. The last thing he needed, or the last thing, or the last person he reached out to was his girlfriend, and she walked away from him. So sometimes understanding, and I like the idea about the superwoman type of thing, is when we don't talk to people about what's going on, or we don't share, people don't know what that tipping point is for you. And so I think we often wear masks and try to keep this facade up that we can do everything, but we can't. To me, it takes more strength to share about where your vulnerabilities are than it is to hide them. And the more that we are honest about who we are and what we can and cannot do, the better we are to not only shoulder the pain for ourselves, but to help others shoulder their pain in those moments when they're the weakest. Suicidality is not something that a person is all the time. Again, it's usually just in those crisis situations, that moment that they just need to get through the next day. As you know, the stats say, and as we know, we are probably one of the most resilient people on this earth. And as women and Black women, we're probably the most resilient. And so there's things that we have endured and we have been through, we have seen and we've heard about that we can overcome and have overcome. But then there's sometimes it's just that one day, the way I woke up that morning or something somebody said, it was just too heavy today. And so if I share with you and I let other people know, I need you to hold me up today, then I can get through till tomorrow. And then be able to listen and be open to hearing what I could do to help myself. The one thing you don't want to do is shut other people down and make the focus about yourself. And I think that in listening to Shanti, I think it's very important to be able to, like she said, is just listen. When people tend to talk more than they listen, you get in the way of that person relieving themselves or whatever it is that's a burden on them. And you insert your ideas and your perceptions on them, and they don't want to talk to you anymore. You've already shut them down. When you talk about, you're a good Christian, Christians don't kill themselves, or you focus on what's going to happen after they die, what we really need to focus on is what they're going to do while they're here. And that's trying to get them help or finding those resources. Again, for me and why I was able to do this work and why I can do it, because I don't focus on what they want to do or why. I focus on how I can get them to the next day. It's a problem for me. So I'm going to give you a solution. I'm going to help you find a solution.
And can I just add, Tasha, thank you so much. You are 100% right. And I just need people to know, like, when I was going through my suicidal ideation, there were a lot of people who would come up and say to me, well, what would you have to kill yourself over? Or, you're Shanti Das, or you had all that money, or you had this career, you had that. None of that mattered. I was in crisis at the moment, to Tasha's point. It was a bad weekend, a bad situation. It was a culmination of a lot of different things. My best friend's suicide, me thinking about and rehashing all of these memories of not properly dealing with my father's suicide, a career change, financial hardships. I walked away from almost a $500,000 a year job to come back home, to be close to the family, to get myself right, to get my mind and my thoughts right. I was dealing with a lot in 2010, but didn't know how to recognize it or what to call it. So, don't say, how could this person do that? They were just in crisis at the moment. So please save the judgment for later for anybody that has died by suicide. And the other thing too, at some point, I want people to know that you can still celebrate your friend, your family member, your colleague's life, even if they died by suicide. Stop dealing with the fact that they passed by suicide and everybody's so hush-hushy. Family can't talk about it, or you don't want to mention it. It happened. The brain is your largest organ in your body, right? Mental illness is real. We all have mental health. We may not all have a mental illness. So save the judgment. Let's learn how to celebrate and love more. And let's lead with empathy, as I said, and not sympathy.
I love that statement. I absolutely love that statement. I'm going to circle back a little bit on a couple of things. Tasha, when we were going through the data earlier, one of our audience members asked the question relative to, is it a myth that men usually are successful at suicide and that women only actually attempt?
So statistically, more men, usually elderly men, white men, are more likely to commit suicide than in America than any other racial group or gender. For some reason, there's this belief system, and statistically, it bears out that women, again, we're more communicative. So in our attempt to try to find a solution for whatever is ailing us, or trying to get resources to help us solve whatever problem we have, the sort of the triggers or the warning signs about us asking for help, unfortunately, some women do use these sort of what we call a soft attempt to try to elicit attention towards the situation. But that attention to me is not the type of attention seeking to get our way, but more so to get a solution to a problem. And so women, more likely, it's just statistics that they will try and attempt and use a softer means to do it, whereas men, they use more lethal means on average. But again, like I said earlier, that is starting to change. And so when you use something like a firearm to shoot yourself, you're most likely are not going to survive that. But if you take some pills, if you take a certain type of pill and a certain number of it, you're not going to survive it. But sometimes people don't necessarily know that. So some of the things that they use don't end their life. And that also sometimes could be worse than ending your life, because you survive. Some people survive a gunshot wound. And then you end up living not only still with that trauma or that pain that you were already dealing with before, and now it's complicated by you surviving something that now you may need help with, or you're debilitated, which on top of all of that. And I've seen that as well.
Wow. Another issue. This is all so powerful and so absolute meaningful. Shanti, going back to your leading with empathy and not with sympathy. Can you both talk a little bit about when we are outreaching to our friends, our loved ones, our village, and we recognize that someone may be dealing with suicidal thoughts, and unfortunately, their attempt was successful. How do we then deal with, quite frankly, some inherent guilt on the missed signs, right? We thought we've had the conversations. We thought that we were connecting. We thought that we were their village and their circle. And Shanti, I love your thought about the starting five. We thought we might have been a member of their starting five, but yet here we are. Mm-hmm. So how can you address a little bit about dealing with those thought processes of missed signs, and making sure that those who are dealing with the thoughts of the missed sign have their own mental health wellness addressed as well?
So I'll just start quickly, and then I'll hand it over to our professional. So as I mentioned, when my best friend took her own life, I was that person. I literally racked my brain, going over and over and over and over in my head of the last conversation that we had, which was, by the way, 24 hours before she shot herself. And I just couldn't figure it out. I couldn't put my finger on it. And it literally tormented me. And so what I'll just say first and foremost, Joy, is if you unfortunately have had a friend or a loved one that you were close to that was successful in taking their own life, you must seek therapy. This is nothing that you should be doing on your own, trying to figure it out, because you can literally drive yourself, and I hate to use the C word, but you could drive yourself, I'll just say, into an emotional breakdown and possibly a psychotic break, because it's no real rhyme or reason in what we can figure out. And if you've never gone to therapy, or just never even have dealt with anyone that has taken their own life, it's too much to process on your own and try to figure out. So first and foremost, I would say is you need to get into grief counseling, which isn't always by a clinician or a therapist. So you can go get grief counseling or a support group, but you do need to see a licensed clinical professor or social worker or somebody that can help you process through all of this, so you can learn. Someone like Tasha and all of her colleagues just have so much more helpful information to share and to give us so many healthy coping mechanisms, right, to get through it. So that's really the best advice, because if I had to do it all over again, I would have gone to grief counseling and found a therapist immediately after it happened. That's a big part of what led to my own suicidal ideation, and the fact that it happened the same way that my dad took his own life. I blamed myself for a very long time, and it really started taking a toll on me.
Thank you for sharing. Tasha?
I think suicide is heaviest, the burden is heaviest on the people who survive, mm-hmm. that are left behind. If we think about suicidality in the context of someone who is in emotional pain, or having a burden on them that is so severe that they don't have a solution for it, that they are seeking relief from that. For them, if they end their life, unfortunately, their pain is over for them. The living is the one that has to deal with it. And I think that oftentimes when a suicide occurs, the person didn't want you to know. Otherwise, if they were still seeking help at the time that they decided to do it, they would have let you know in some way. But if you didn't know, that's because they didn't want you to know.
Mhm.
And so, and I think we worry so much because there's this perception that we should have done something. Suicide is a personal decision. And so when a person has decided that they're not thinking about anybody else other than themselves and ending whatever they're going through. But death, like all other deaths, is painful for those who are left behind. I think that it is important to seek help, and it's a natural thing to be sad. It's a natural thing to question whether or not you could have done something. That's a natural process that we go through in grief. But for me, in surviving a suicide by my aunt, who she and I were months apart, we grew up like sisters, and I was a suicide prevention counselor. You know, I've helped hundreds of people, but I couldn't do nothing for her. One, she didn't want me to know, and two, she didn't want me to save her. And while it was hard to know that she was gone and she won't be here to share the rest of our lives with, I knew that if she wanted me to help her, she would have asked me, and she know I would have been there because of who we were to each other. And so I think that, you know, when you're talking about this individual, it's important to kind of remember what your relationship was. Everybody, we know what to do in real time. Questioning whether or not we could have done something, if you knew what they were going to do, you know absolutely you would have done something differently. But you do the best you can with what you know in real time. And at the end of the day, that's all you can do.
And I want to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, the only other thing I would say is we get to the resource. I think it's important, again, to kind of understand how to talk to someone who is suicidal, recognizing the signs and knowing where to go to get help. If you ever encounter someone like that, those are the three things I think is important that that we kind of talk about and be able to equip you with, so that if you have those experiences, that will be part of the kind of thing that you can fall back on when you know, if you have a situation where you may have to deal with that. At least you know that you've done everything you can and the best you can when you have the opportunity.
And I just wanted to add to what Tasha was saying. We also, again, we got to remember that, you know, there's so many layers to this, right? And to the individual's process and what they're going through. They could have a current mental illness and haven't sought treatment for that, right? They could have bipolar disorder, anxiety disorder, or other things that, you know, inhibit them from thinking properly, right? So we can't blame the victim in what is happening. They could have a substance abuse disorder. It could be a stressful life situation. It could be a chronic physical illness, right? That's leading to the anxiety and depression mentally. It's just so many different things that person could be going through. Certainly, we want to educate people so that they do know the warning signs and symptoms, and we can try to get them help. But that's why the overall conversation around mental health and the different type of mental illnesses that exist is so very important. Because, you know, I've had friends and family members that have suffered from bipolar disorder, but when they're talking to you, now I might see them talking to themselves, or they may be experiencing schizophrenia, but when they're talking to you, they can mask it. Right, because the mind is a beautiful thing. It's a lot of the ways that they can mask situations, and so you really got to be in tune with your loved one or your friend if you think something else may be going on, even before you start seeing signs, you know, of suicidal ideation or them giving away their belongings or saying how much they love you. But we just got to pay attention to people, right? So gone are the days where those that are close to us, you can be like, "Oh, hey, how you doing?" and you just expect that good. Be careful when you ask somebody how they're doing, because you really should want them to tell you how they're doing. And I would say how you feeling as opposed to how you doing. Because when you ask somebody how they're feeling, that's very different than how you're doing, right? Because then you will open the door and allow them to express their feelings and kind of talk about what's going on. I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm trying to be a little bit mindful of time, and we're getting some very good questions in the chat. And I just want to say, if we're not able to answer and address your question while we're live, we'll put the answers in our chat. And even once we're ended, we could be able, point you to some resources and get some answers to your questions. So thank you for all of your thought-provoking questions. I'm gonna go back one more time, just a little bit. And we've talked a lot about suicide ideation, in the Black women in our village, in our strength. But can you guys address for us in the little bit of time that we have left, the stigma around Black men and suicide, especially in this era of social injustice, and that things that we're being bombarded with that are very real, but we see it 24 hours a day, and how especially our young Black men are dealing with just the heaviness that's going on in this country right now, and how possibly some of this heaviness, if they are not able to cope, process, and deal with, could lead to suicidal thoughts. Tasha, I'll start with you and your thoughts on that.
I would say the stigma about Black men and suicide really is the Black community at large. I think that because of all the things we've gone through historically, I think what our families have gone through and what we've gone through as individuals, if you look at our culture today and even yesterday, there's always been this idea that we can handle everything, that we should be able to do anything, the turn the cheek sort of mentality. And that, normalizing how to ask for help, I think, is the biggest tool we have to be able to increase the likelihood of people to seek help and ask for help. Talking to someone else about our problems, the perception in our community, especially around our Black men, is that that's a sign of weakness. And so if they ask for help, you must know how to handle your business. They're already put upon with everything outside of the home about what they can or cannot do, who they are, who they should be. And so with all of that going on, and then you say, oh, I had a bad day, or, I'm having problems with my wife, or I don't know what's going on with my kids, then a person, are often looked at, and even us sometimes look at our men and say, is something wrong with him? He must don't know, what he's doing. And so we got to be very careful with how we encourage our mates, our husbands, our brothers, our boyfriends with sharing, because sometimes how we talk to them may could either encourage them to seek help, or it pushes them further into the closet because of the way that we perceive them ourselves. So I think we have to do a better job than what the world is doing to help ourselves, because of the way that we perceive and some of the perceptions or the belief systems we have about how our men should be ourselves. Just some thoughts I have.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add to that. We have to give our Black men permission to cry, to feel, and to heal. To echo what Tasha was saying, there's a really great website, therapyforblackmen.org. And they have a really good Instagram page as well. And it's a lot of men sharing their lived experiences and stories. And you're seeing more barbershops do trainings around mental health and mental wellness, because barbershop essentially was, line of defense,
yes,
if you will, right? But they don't want to call it that. But it's an opportunity for them to open up and share. But we as Black women have to allow our Black men and not tell them that they're weak, or not look at them like something is wrong. And quite frankly, I think, we need to look at family therapy as African Americans, because I think that would have really played a big role in the treatment and just the well-being of my family. Had my mom taken her 3 kids to therapy over the years, and we talked about it collectively as a family about what the suicide did to our family and how we felt about it and how we matured as individuals. And so I encourage Black family therapy as well as individual therapy.
And
Thank
if I can,
Go ahead.
one more quick thing, I think, when we talk about suicide, that's like at the critical juncture. I think it's important to try to intervene as soon as we can. And so when we're talking about someone having a problem or they're in an emotional situation, how we talk to people and how we introduce the idea of getting help will make all the difference on whether or not somebody will seek help. So,
Yeah.
for example, really quickly, I want to talk about when someone talks about or makes a gesture about wanting to commit suicide, and you say, "Oh, you're not really going to do that, are you?" There's nothing about my expression or me shaking my head is encouraging you to talk to me.
Mhm.
You know, so you so when we are approaching someone around suicidality and you want to know how do I talk to someone, you want to be open and try to get them to talk and you listen truly. And you want to make sure your body language and your words are congruent with each other, because sometimes we can say, oh, it's okay to talk about your suicidality, but you're looking at your clock or you're trying to, or your watch, or you're trying to rush them through the conversation. If we present the idea of seeking help as a legitimate thing and an okay thing, people are more likely to follow through. If you present it as something like there's something wrong with you for even asking for help and you just need to go to therapy, then the person probably won't go.
Mhm.
So be mindful about how you introduce the idea of seeking help, because it'll make a difference in whether or not they actually go.
Mhm.
That is big. And it's something I would have never thought about either, because it's body language is telling. It speaks what's in your heart. Trying to be mindful of time, because when I tell you we could talk about this all night, there are so many issues that we could unpack, because we haven't even touched on, we have, but just not as deep as I like to go, around anxiety. And to me, anxiety equals 2020. That's a whole nother session for a whole nother day. But I really would like us to talk a little bit about the tools that we need in our tool belt and our tool chest to help ourselves as well as our village to recognize the signs of suicide, to help with coping with suicide ideation, to help others seek help around suicide, and just overall mental wellness as an overall issue. And for those of us in our audience, we're going to talk some about those tools, both Tasha and Shanti, but we will also post a site full of tools on our Camellia Rose Links Facebook page. So if you're not able to write them down now, please visit that page when this call concludes and it's being recorded. Thank you, Melanie. And, research these different resources, find one that is applicable to your situation, or if you want to find out more information. And if you need to outreach to either Shanti and or Tasha, will make sure that their information is provided as well. So Shanti, I'll start with you to talk a little bit of some about the tools, please.
Sure. I'll quickly go through the list. So the first thing that you need to know around suicidal ideation is everyone should have listed the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number, which is 1-800-273-TALK. And they have counselors available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to help de-escalate the crisis situation. Again, this is something that I use, so I know it works. And I've done a lot of work with this national organization. The next one is the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, another wonderful foundation that you can go on, www.asfp.org, and they have additional resources for you. If you're in crisis, you can text the word silence to 741-741 and immediately be connected with a counselor to help you de-escalate the crisis situation, and then they can put you in touch with a therapist in your area. Also, from a cultural perspective, therapyforblackgirls.com is a really amazing website, and they have an incredible podcast. Also, Silence to Shame has a podcast on iTunes, Google Play, and SoundCloud. We've had it for 3 years. Our very first podcast features one of our board members whose daughter took her own life about 7 years ago. Really powerful story. And there are a ton of other articles that I listed under here. And I just want to mention that Silence to Shame does QPR training, which is suicide prevention training. And the Q stands for question, the P stands for respond. The R stands for respond and the P stands for persuade. And it's an excellent program. You can go to qprinstitute.com. It's an hour and a half training, and I really encourage everyone to take it. I'm going to partner hopefully with this organization so that we can offer a free class in the month of October, and it could very well save a life in your family or your community.
Thank you. Ladies, this conversation has been beyond impactful, beyond important. We thank both of you for your time, for your talent, and for your insight. And I will turn it back over to Charla to close us out.
Thank you, Joy. On behalf of the members of the Camellia Rose, Georgia chapter of the Links Incorporated, we would thank you so much for joining our live stream. And we've had such a great conversation on the impact of suicide in our community, and have just learned, pretty much learned all the things that we really need to learn about, and that there's just so much more. And so please check out our resources page, and please also take our survey, which will help us to provide even better content for you. And remember that if you have any questions that were unanswered, to check the comments, and we'll have written answers in there for you. Thank you to our moderator, Joy White. Thank you so much to our panelists, Shanti Das and Dr. Tasha. We appreciate you, and we'll have you anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.